Yeah, there you are. Come on in. And good evening. Welcome to the campfire. It's good to see you. We're all getting ready here to tell some stories and hang out, have a drink or two, and maybe roast some marshmallows. We've been doing a bit of that lately. Well, tonight I've got a story I'm going to start with, and it's from our Max Brand book, The Seventh Man. It's book 3, remember, of the Untamed. And we're all the way up to chapter 10. I want to start there. We're kind of getting to an exciting part where it looks like it might be a chase scene to start with here. It might be some gunplay. Let's get started. Chapter 10. One trail ends. Well, you can trust Gray Molly to me, Vic, said Dan, standing at the head of the gray mare. I'll keep her as safe as if she was with Satan. Greg watched her almost sadly. He'd always taken a rather childish pride in her fierceness. She knew him as a dog knows its master, and he'd always been the only one who could handle her readily in the saddle. But one who knew nothing of horses and their ways could see the entente which had been instantly established between Barry and Gray Molly. When he spoke, her ears pricked. When he raised his hand, she stretched her nose inquisitively. There was no pitch in her when Barry swung into the saddle, and that was a thing without precedent in Molly's history. She tried none of her usually cat-like sidesteps and throwing of the head. Altogether, Vic was troubled, even as if he would have been at the sight of Betty Neal in the arms of another man. It was desertion. Dan, he said, I know what you've done for me, and I know what you're doing now. He took the slender hand of the other in his big paw. If the time comes when I can pay you back, so help me God. Oaths don't do no good, cut in Barry without a trace of emotion. He added frankly, it ain't altogether for your sake. Those gents down there have played tag once with me, and now I'd like to play with them. Molly's fresh today. He was already looking over his shoulder while he spoke, as if his mind were even then at work upon the posse. So long, partner, good luck. So they parted, and Vic, jogging slowly up the steep path, saw Gray Molly wheeled and sent at a sweeping gallop over the meadow. His heart leaped jealously, and the next moment went out in a flood of gratitude, admiration, as Barry swung off the shoulder of the mountain, waved his hat towards Kate, and dipped at once out of sight. The shelving ground along which Barry rode sometimes was a broad surface like a spacious, graded road. Again it shelved away and opened up a view of all the valley. When he reached the first of these places, the rider looked back and down and saw the posse skirting rapidly on his side of the river, behind him and close to the cliff. They rode at an easy lope. He could see that their heads were bent to watch the ground. Even at this casual gait, they would reach the point at which he and the gray must swing onto the floor of the valley before him, unless he urged Molly to top speed. He must get there at a sufficient distance from them to escape close rifle fire, and certainly beyond point-blank revolver range. Accordingly, he threw his weight more into the stirrups and over the withers of the mare. This brought greater poundage on her forehand and made her apt to stumble or actually miss her step, but it increased her running power. There was no need of a touch of the spurs. The gathering of the reins seemed to tell Molly everything. One ear flickered back, then she leapt out at full speed. It was as though the mind of the man had sent an electric current down the reins and told her his thought. Now she floundered at her foot, struck a loose stone. Now she veered sharply and wide to escape a boulder. And now she cleared a gully with a long leap, and riding high as he was, bent forward out of balance to escape observation from below. It was only a miracle of horsemanship that kept her from breaking her neck as they lurched down the pitch. Gray Molly seemed to be carrying no weight, only a clinging intelligence. At this speed he was sure to reach the valley safely in front, unless the posse caught sight of him on the way and gave chase. And Barry counted on that instinct in hunting men which makes them keep their eyes low. the same sense which leads a searcher to look first under the bed and last of all at the wall and the ceiling. Once more, as he neared his goal, he looked back and he looked down, and there came the 6 horsemen, their quirts a-swinging, their hat brim blown straight up as they raced at full speed. They had seen the gray, and they rode for blood. The outstretched neck of Grey Molly, her flattened ears, the rapid clangor of her hooves on the rocks, seemed to indicate that she already was doing her uttermost. But after the glimpse of the pursuit, Barry crouched a little lower, his hand gathering the reins just behind her head, and his voice was near her, speaking softly, quickly. She responded with a snort of effort, as though she realized the danger and willingly accepted it. One ear, as she rushed down the slope, was pricked, and one flagged back to the guiding, strengthening voice of the rider. The path wound in leisurely curves now, but there was a straight cut down the slide of gravel, a dangerous slope even in firm ground, a terrible angle with those loose pebbles underfoot. Yet this was a time for chance-taking. Already the dusty man on the roan rode with his revolver balanced for the snap shot. The next instant his gun swung down. He actually reined up in astonishment. The fugitive had flung himself far back against the cantle and sent Grey Molly at the slide. It was not a matter of running as the mare shot over the brink. Molly sat on her haunches, braced her forelegs, and went down like an avalanche. Over the rush and roar of the pebbles, over the yell of wonder from the pursuers, she heard the voice of her rider, a clear and a steady voice, and the tautened reins telegraphed to her bewildered mind the wish of the man. She struck the level with stunning force, toppled, nearly fell, and then straightened along her course in a staggering gallop. Started from its nice balance by the rush of stones they loosened, a 10-ton rock came toppling after, leaped up from the valley floor like a live thing, and then thundered away towards the river. Grey Molly, finding her legs once more, tried the level going. She had beaten the same horses before under the crushing impost of Greg's weight, but with this lighter rider, who clung like a part of her, who gave perfectly to the rhythm of her gallop, she fairly walked away from the posse. Once, twice, and again, the gun spoke from the hand of Pete Glass, but it was the taking of a long last chance rather than a sign of closing on his chase. In 10 minutes, Grey Molly dipped out of sight among the hills. After the first hour, Barry could have cut away across country with little fear of discovery from the sheriff. But he was in no hurry to escape. Sometimes he dismounted and looked to his cinches and talked to the horse. Grey Molly listened with pricking ears and often canted her head to one side, as though she strove to understand the game. It was a new and singular pleasure to Barry. He had accustomed to the exhaustless, elastic strength of Satan with the cunning brain of a beast of prey, the speed of an antelope. On that black horse he could have ridden circles around that posse all day long. But Grey Molly was a different problem. She was not a force to be simply directed and controlled. She was something to be helped. Her very weakness, compared with the stallion, appealed to him. And it was a thrilling pleasure to feel his power over her grow until she also seemed to have entered the game. And a game it was, as he had said to Vic when they parted, with the rather essential difference that in this pastime one was tagged with a .45 caliber chunk of lead and was quite apt to remain it for the remainder of eternity. Barry dropped further and further back towards the posse. The danger fascinated him. Once he whistled high and shrill as a hawk's scream from the top of a bluff, while the posse labored through a ravine below. He saw the guns flash out, and he waited. He heard the sing of the bullets around him, the splashing lead on a solid rock face just beneath him. He listened till the deep echoes spoke from the gulch, then waved his hat and disappeared. This was almost defeating the purpose of his play, for if he came that close again, they would probably make out that they were following a decoy. Accordingly, since he had now drawn them well away from Vic's line of escape, he turned his back reluctantly on the posse, struck back across the hills. He kept on for a better part of an hour before he doubled and swung in a wide circle toward his cabin. He had laid out a course which the wise sheriff could follow until dark, and be none the wiser. And if Pete Glass were the finest trailer who ever studied sign, and he'd never be able to read the tokens of the return ride. Accordingly, with all this well in mind, he brought Grey Molly to a full halt and gazed around, utterly stunned by surprise, when halfway up the valley, a rifle spoke, small but sharp from one side, and a bullet clipped the rocks not the length of the horse away. He understood. When he cut straight away across the country, he had indeed left a baffling trail, a trail so dim, in fact, that Pete Glass had wisely given it up and had taken the long chance by cutting back to the point at which the hunt began. So their paths crossed. Barry spoke sharply to the mare and loosed the reins, but she started into a full gallop too late. There came a brief hum, a thudding blow, and Grey Molly pitched forward. Chapter 11, A New Trail Begins. If he had been an ordinary rider, sitting heavily far back in the saddle at the end of a long ride, Barry would either have been flung clear and smashed horribly against the rocks, or more likely he would have been entangled in the stirrups and crushed to death instantly by the weight of his horse. But he rode always lightly poised, and when the mare pitched forward, his feet were already clear of the stirrups. He landed, cat-like, on hands and feet, unhurt. That had been a long shot, a lucky hit, even for a marksman of the sheriff's caliber. And now the 6 horsemen streamed over a distant hilltop and swept into the valley to take their quarry dead, or half dead, from his fall. However, that approaching danger was nothing in the eye of Barry. He ran to the fallen mare and caught her head in his arms. She ceased her struggles to rise as soon as he touched her and whinnied softly. The left foreleg lay twisted horribly beneath her, broken. Grey Molly had run her last race. And as Barry kneeled, holding the brave head close to him, he groaned, and he looked away from her eyes. It was only an instant of weakness, and when he turned to her again, he was drawing his gun from its holster. The beating hooves of the posse as they raced toward him made a growing murmur through the clear air. Barry glanced toward them with a consummate loathing. They had killed a horse to stop a man, and to him it was more than murder. What harm had she done them except to carry her rider bravely and well? The tears of rage and sorrow which a child sheds welled into the eyes of Dan Barry. Every one of them had a hand in this horrible killing, was to that half-animal and half-childish nature a murderer. His chin was on his shoulder. A quiver of pain in her nostrils ended as he spoke, and while the fingers of his left hand trailed carelessly across her forehead, his right carried the muzzle to her temple. "Brave Molly, good girl," he whispered. "They'll pay for you a death for a death, and now a man for a hoss." The yellow which had glinted in his eyes during the run was afire now. "It ain't far, only a step to go, and then you'll be where there ain't no saddles, nor any spurs to gall you, Molly, but just pastures it's green all year, and nothing to do but loaf in the sun and smell the wind. Here's a good luck to you, girl." His gun spoke sharp and short, and he laid the limp head reverently on the ground. It had all happened in a very few seconds, and the posse was riding through the river, still a long shot off, when Barry drew his rifle from its case on the saddle. Moreover, the failing light, which had made the sheriff's hit so much a matter of luck, was now still dimmer. Yet Barry snapped his gun to his shoulder and fired the instant the butt lay in the groove. For another moment, nothing changed in the appearance of the riders. Then a man leaned out of his saddle and fell full length in the water. Around him his companions floundered, lifted, and placed him on the bank, and then threw themselves from their horses to take shelter behind the first rocks they could find. They had no wish to take chances with a man who could snap-shoot like this, in such light, at such a distance. By the time they were in position, their quarry had slipped out of sight, and they only had the blackening boulders for targets. "God almighty," cried Ronicky Joe. "Are you going to let that murdering hound dog get clear off Pete? Boys, who's with me for a run at him?" For it was Harry Fisher who had fallen and now lay on the wet bank with his arms flung wide and a red spot rimmed with purple in the center of his forehead. And Fisher was Ronicky Joe's partner. "You lay where you are," commanded the sheriff, and indeed there had been no rousing response to Ronicky Joe's appeal. "You yaller quitters," groaned Joe. "Give me a square chance and I'll tackle Vic Gregg alone day or night, on hoss or on foot. Are we 5 going to lay down to him?" "If that was Vic Gregg," answered the sheriff, slipping over the insult with perfect calm, "I wouldn't have told you to scatter for cover. But that ain't Vic." "Pete, what in hell are you driving at?" "I say it ain't Vic," said the sheriff. "Vic is a good man with a hoss and a good man with a gun, but he couldn't never ride like that gent over there in the rocks, and he couldn't shoot like him." He pointed, in confirmation, at the body of Harry Fisher. "You can rush that hill if you want, but speaking personal, I ain't ready to die." A thoughtful silence held the others until Silver Waldron broke in with his deep bass. "You ain't far off, Pete. I done some thinking along them lines when I seen him standing up there over by the arroyo waving his hat at the bullets. Vic didn't never have the guts for that." All the lower valley was gray, dark in comparison with the bright peaks above it, before the sheriff rose from his place and led that posse towards the body of Gray Molly. There they found as much confirmation of Pete's theory as they needed, for Vic's silver-mounted saddle was known to all of them, and this was a plain affair which they found on a dead horse. Waldron pushed back his hat to scratch his head. "Look at them eyes, boys," he suggested. "Molly has been beating us all day, and she looked like she's fighting us still." The sheriff was not a man of very many words, surely of little sentiment. Perhaps it was the heat of the long chase, which now made him take off his hat so that the air could reach his sweaty forehead. "Gents," he said, "she lived game and she died game. But they ain't no use of wasting that saddle. Take it off." And that was Gray Molly's epitaph. They decided to head straight back for the nearest town with the body of Harry Fisher, and fagged by the desperate riding of the day they let their horses go with loose rein at a walk. Darkness gathered, and the last light faded from even the highest peaks. The last tinge of color dropped out of the sky as they climbed from the valley. Now and then one of the horses cleared its nostrils with a snort, but on the whole they went in perfect silence, with the short grass silencing their hoof-beats, and never a word passed from man to man. Beyond doubt, if it had not been for that same silence, if it had not been for the slowness with which they drifted through the dark, what follows could never have happened. They had crossed a hill, and they had descended into a very narrow ravine, which came to so sharp a point that the horses had to string out in single file. The ravine twisted up to the right, and then the last man of the procession heard the sheriff call, "Halt there! Up with your hands or I'll drill you." When they swung from side to side, craning their heads to look, they made out a shadowy horseman facing Pete head on. Then the sheriff's voice again. "Gregg, I'm considerable glad to meet up with you. If that meeting hadn't taken place in any other spot, probably Gregg would have taken his chance on escaping through the night. But in this narrow pass, he could swing to neither side, and before he could turn that brown horse entirely around, the sheriff might pump him full of lead." They gathered in a solemn quiet around him. The irons were already upon his wrist. "All right, boys," he said, "you got me. But you'll have to give in that you had all the luck." A moment after that sharp command in the familiar, dreaded voice of Pete Glass, Vic had been glad that the lone flight was over. Eventually this was bound to come. He would go back and face the law, and 3 men lived to swear that Blondie had gone after his gun first. "Maybe luck," said the sheriff. "How'd you come back this way?" "Made a plumb circle," chuckled Gregg. "Rode like a fool, not caring where I hit out for, and And at the end of it was that it was dark before I'd had sense to watch where the sun went down. "Kind of cheerful, ain't you?" cut in Ronicky Joe, and his voice was as dry as the crisping leaves in an autumn wind. "There ain't any call for me to wear crepe yet," answered Greg. "Worst fool thing I ever done was to cut and run for it. The old captain would tell you gents that Blondie went for his gun first. Had it clean out of the leather before I touched mine." He paused, and the silence of those dark figures sunk in upon him. "I got to warn you," says Pete Glass, "that what you say now can be used agin you later on before the jury." "My good boys," burst out Vic, "do you think I'm a plain low-down murdering snake? Harry, ain't you got a word for me? Are you like the rest of 'em?" No voice answered. "Harry," said Ronicky, "why don't you speak to him?" It was a brutal thing to do, but Ronicky was never a gentle sort in his best moments. He scratched a match and held it so that under the sputtering light Greg found himself staring into the face of Harry Fisher, and he could not turn his eyes away until that match burned down to Ronicky's fingertip, then dropped in a streak of red to the ground. Then that sheriff spoke cold and hard. "Partner," he said, "in the old days maybe your line of talk would do some good, but not now. You picked that fight with Blondie. You knew you was faster on the draw and Hanson didn't have a chance. He was the worst shot in Alder, and everybody in Alder knew it. You picked that fight, and you killed your man, and now you're gonna hang for it." Another hush, no murmur of assent or dissent. "But there's one way out for you, Greg, and I'm laying it clear. We wanted you bad, and we got you. But they's another man we want a lot worse, a pile. Greg, take me where I can find the gent what done here to Harry Fisher, and you'll never stand up in front of a jury. You got my word on that." Chapter 12, The Crisis. Those mountains above the Barry cabin were, as he told Vic Gregg, inaccessible to men on horseback except by one path. Yet there was a single class of travelers who roamed at will through far more difficult ground than this. Speaking in general, where a man can go, a burro can go. And where a burro can go, he usually manages to carry his pack. He crawls up a raged down pitch of rocks that comes dangerously close to the perpendicular. He walks securely along a crumbling ledge with half his body over 1,000 years of emptiness. Therefore, the prospectors with their burros have combed the worst mountains in the West, and it was hardly a surprise to Kate Barry when she saw the two men come down the steepest slope above the cabin, with two little pack animals scrambling and sliding before them. It was still some time before nightfall, but the sun had dropped out of sight fully an hour ago, and now the western mountains were blackening against a sky whose thin, clear blue grew yellow towards evening. Against that dark mass of the mountainside, she could not make out the two travelers clearly, so she shaded her eyes and peered up high. The slope was so sheer that if she saw one of the four figures lost footing, it would come crashing to her very feet. When they saw her and shouted down, the sound fell as clearly as if they had called from the cabin. Yet they had a good half-hour's labor between the greeting and the moment they came out on the level in front of Kate. From the instant they called, she remained in motionless, deep thought. And when they came down into full view, she cried out joyously, "Buck! Oh, Buck!" and ran towards them. Even the burros stopped, and the men stood statue-like. It's rarely enough that one finds a human being in these mountains, almost an act of providence that leads to a house, and a miracle when the trail crosses the path of a friend. The prospectors came out of their daze with a shout and rushed to meet her. Each of them had her by a hand, wringing it. They talked all together in a storm of words. "Kate, I'm dreaming. Dear old Buck. Have you forgotten me? Lee Haines, I should say not. Don't pay any attention to him. 5 years. And I've been hungering to see you all that. Where have you been? Everywhere. But this is the best thing I've seen. Come in. Wait till we get these packs off these poor little devils. Oh, I'm so glad to see you, glad. Hurry up, Lee. Your fingers asleep? How long have you been out? 5 months? Then you're hungry. Well, we've just ate. But a piece of pie? Pie? I've been dreaming of pie. A fire already burned in the big living room of the cabin, for at this season, at such an altitude, the shadows were always cold, and around the fire they gathered, each of the men with half a huge pie before him. They were such as one might expect the mountain region to produce, big, gaunt, hard-muscled. They'd gone unshaven for so long that their faces were closed, not with an unsightly stubble, but with strong, short beard that gave them a certain grim dignity, and made their eyes seem sunken. They were opposite types, which is usually the case when two men strike out together. Buck Daniels was black-haired, with an ugly, shrewd face and a suggestion of rather dangerous possibilities of swift action. But Lee Haines was a great bulk of a man with tawny beard, handsome, in a leonine fashion, more poised than Daniels, fitted to crush. The sharp glance of Buck flitted here and there. In 10 seconds, he knew everything in the room. The steady, blue eyes of Lee Haines went leisurely from place to place and lingered, but both of them stared at Kate as if they just could not get enough of her. They talked without pause while they ate. A stranger in the room would have sealed their lips in utter taciturnity, but here they sat with a friend. 5 months of loneliness and labor behind them, and they gossiped like girls. Into the jangle of talk cut a thin, small voice from outside, a burst of laughter. Then, "Bart, you silly dog," and Joan stood at the open door with her hands buried in the mane of a wolf dog. The forks of Buck Daniels stopped halfway to his lips, and Lee Haines straightened until the chair groaned. They spoke together, hushed voices. "Kate." "Come here, Joan." Her face glistened with pride, and Joan came forward with wide eyes, tugging Black Bart along in a reluctant progress. "It ain't possible," whispered Buck Daniels. "Honey, come here and shake hands with your Uncle Buck." The gesture called forth deep-throated warning from Bart, and he caught back his hand with a start. "It's always that way," said Kate, half amused, half vexed. "Bart won't let a soul touch her when Dan isn't home. Good old Bart. Go away, you foolish dog. Don't you see these are friends?" He cringed a little under the shadow of the hand which waved him off, but his only answer was a silent baring of the teeth. "You see how it is? I'm almost afraid to touch her myself when Dan's away. She and Bart bully me all day long." In the meantime, the glance of Joan had cloyed itself with sufficient examination of the strangers, and now she turned back towards the door in the meadow beyond. "Bart," she called softly. The sharp ears of the dog quivered. He came to attention with a start. "Look, get it for me." One loud scraping of his claws on the floor as he started, and Black Bart went like a bolt through the door with Joan scrambling after him. Screaming with excitement from the outside, they heard the cry of a frightened squirrel, and then its angry chattering from a place of safety up a tree. "Shall I call her back again?" asked Kate. "Not if Bart comes with her," answered Lee Haines. "I've seen enough of him to last me a while." "Well, we'll have her to ourselves when Dan comes. Of course Bart leaves her to tag around after Dan." "When's he coming back?" asked Buck, with polite interest. "Any time. I don't know, but he's always here before it's completely dark." The glance of Buck Daniels kicked over to Lee Haines, exchanged meanings with him, and came back to Kate. "Terrible sorry," he said, "but I suppose we'll have to be on our way before it's plumb dark." "Go so soon as that? Why, I won't let you." began Haines, fumbling for words. We got to get down in that valley before it's dark," filled in Buck. Suddenly she laughed, frankly, happily. "I know what you mean, but Dan has changed. He isn't the same man he used to be." "Yes?" queried Buck, without conviction. "You'll have to see him to believe it, Buck, but he doesn't even whistle anymore." "What?" "He only goes about singing now." The two men exchanged glances of such astonishment that Kate could not help but notice, and flushed just a little. "Well," murmured Buck, "Bart doesn't seem to have changed much from the old days." She laughed slowly. letting her mind run back. Such happiness as they could not understand. And when she looked up, she seemed to debate whether or not it would be worth while to let them in on the delightful secret. The moment she dwelt on the burning logs, they gazed at her, and then to each other with utter amazement, as if they sat in the same room with the dead come to life. No care of motherhood had marked her face, but on the white, even forehead was a sign of peace. And drifting over her hands and on the white apron across her lap, the firelight pooled dim gold, the wealth of contentment. If you'd been here today, you would have seen how changed he is. We had a man with us whom Dan had taken while he was running from a posse, wounded, and kept him here until he was well, and, well, that's Dan, murmured Lee Haines. He's gold all through and through when a man's in trouble. Shut up, Lee, cut in Buck. He sat forward in his chair, drinking up her story. Go on. Well, this morning we saw the same posse skirting through the valley. We knew that they were on the old trail. Dan sent Greg over the hills and rode Vic's horse down so that the posse would mistake him and he could lead them out of the way. I was afraid, terribly. I was afraid so that if the posse got close and began shooting, Dan would... She stopped. Her eyes begged them to understand. Go on, said Lee Haines, shuddering slightly. I know what you mean. But I watched him ride down the slope, she cried joyously, and I saw the posse close on him, almost on top of him when he reached the valley. I saw the flash of their guns. I saw them shoot. I wasn't afraid that Dan would be hurt, for he seems to wear a charm against bullets. I wasn't much afraid of that. But I dreaded to see him turn and go back through that posse like a storm. But... She caught both hands to her breast and her face tilted up. Even when the bullets must have been whistling around him, he didn't look back. He rode straight on and on out of view, and I knew. Her voice broke with emotion. Oh, Buck, I knew that he had won, and I had won, and that he was safe forever, that there was no danger of him ever slipping back into that terrible other self. That I knew that I'd never again have to dream of that whistling in the wind. I knew that he was ours. Jones and mine. By God, broke out Buck, I'm happier than if you'd found a gold mine, Kate. It don't seem no ways, but if you'd seen that with your own eyes, it's possible true. He's changed. I've been almost afraid to be happy all these years, she said, but now I want to sing and cry at the same time. My heart is so full that it's overflowing, Buck. She brushed the tears away and smiled at them. Tell me all about yourselves, everything. You first, Lee. You've been longer away. He did not answer for a moment, but sat with his head fallen, watching her thoughtfully. Women had been the special curse in Lee Haines's life, and they had driven him to the crime that sent him west into outlawry long years ago. Through women, as he himself foreboded, he would come to last to some sordid, petty end, but here sat the only one he had loved without question, without regret, purely and deeply. And as he watched her, more beautiful than she had been in her girlhood, it seemed, as he heard the fitful laughter of Joan outside, the old sorrow came storming up in him, and the sense of loss. Well, what have I been doing? He murmured at length. He shrugged away his last thoughts. I drifted about for a while after that pardon came down from the governor. People knew me, you see, and what they knew about me didn't please them. Even today, Jim Silent and Jim Silent's crew hadn't forgotten. They don't look at me like that, Kate. No, I played straight all the time. Then I ran into Buck, and he and I had tried each other out and had at least one thing in common. Here he looked at Buck, and they both flushed. And we made a partnership of it. We've been together 5 years now. I knew you'd break away, Lee. I used to tell you that. You helped me more than you knew, he said quietly. She smiled, then turned to escape him. And now you, Buck? Well, since we've made a bit of coin punching cows, and we've bloated again prospecting. Bloated in, Kate. We've shot enough powder to lift that mountain yonder, but all we've got is color. You could gild the sky with what we've seen, but we haven't washed enough dust to wear a hole in a paper tissue pocket. I'll tell you the whole story. Lee packs a jinx with him, but Haines, did you ever see a lion as big as that? The dimness of evening had grown rapidly through the room while they talked, and now the light from the door was far less than the glow of the fire. The yellow flicker picked out a dozen pelts stretching as rugs on the floor or hanging along the wall. That to which Buck pointed was an enormous skin of a mountain lion, stretched sidewise, for if it had been hung straight up, a considerable portion of the trail would have dragged on the floor. Buck went to examine it. Presently, he exclaimed in surprise, and he passed his fingers over it, as though searching for something. "Well, where was it shot, Kate? I don't find nothing but this cut that looks like his knife slipping when he was skinning it." "It was a knife that killed it." "What?" "Don't ask me about it. I see the picture of it in my dreams still. The lion had dragged the trap into a cave, and Bart followed it. Dan went in pushing his rifle before him, but when he tried to fire, it jammed." "Yes?" they cried together. "Don't ask me the rest." They would hardly have let her off so easily if it had not been for the entrance of Joan, who had come back on account of the darkness. Black Bart went promptly to a corner of the hearth and lay down with his head on his paws, and the little girl sat beside him watching the fire, her head leaning warily on his shoulder. Kate went to the door. "It's almost night," she said. "Why isn't he here?" "Buck, they couldn't have overtaken—" she started. "Dan?" Buck Daniels grinned reassuringly. "Not unless his hoss is a pile of bones. If it has any heart in it, Dan'll run away from anything on four legs. No call for worrying, Kate. He simply led him a long ways off and waiting for evening before he doubled back. He'll come back right enough. If they didn't catch him that first run, they'll never get the wind of him." It quieted her for a time, but as the minutes slipped away, as the darkness grew more and more heavy until a curtain of black fell across the open door, they could see that she was struggling to control her trouble. They could see her straining to catch some distant sound. Lee Haines began to talk valiantly, to beguile the waiting time, and Buck Daniels did his share of the stories of their prospecting. But eventually, more and more often, silence came upon the group. They began to watch the fire, and they winced when a log crackled or when a sap in a green place hissed. By degrees, they pushed farther and farther back, so that the light would not strike so fully upon them, for in some way it became difficult to meet each other's eyes. Only Joan was perfectly at ease. She played for a time with the ears of Black Bart, or pried open his mouth and made him show his great white fangs, or scratched odd designs on the hearth with a piece of charcoal. But finally she lost interest in all these things and let her head lie on the rough pelt of the wolf dog, sound asleep. The firelight made her hair a patch of gold. Black Bart slept soundly too. That is, as soundly as one of his nature could sleep, for every now and then one of his ears twitched, or he stirred a paw, or an eyelid quivered up. Yet they all started when he jumped from his sleep into full wakefulness. The motion made Joan sit up, rubbing her eyes, and Black Bart reached the center of the room noiselessly. He stood facing the door, motionless. "It's Dan," cried Kate. "Bart hears him. Good old Bart." The dog pointed up his nose, and the hair about his neck bristled into a ruff, and out of his quaking body came a sound that seemed to moan and whimper from the distance at first, but drew nearer, louder, packed the room with terror, the long, drawn howl of a wolf. Yeah, gosh darn. Always seems to mess things up, doesn't he? Looks like he's hit another tight spot. Kind of like the way the world works. Well, the story's about him, and we got a ways to go in the book, so he'll probably work his way out of this one too, folks. And we'll find out about it next time we get around this campfire. It's good seeing y'all. Can't wait to see you again next week. Until then, be good. This is Clay Steele. Good night.